The world knew him as Michael Corleone, the cold-blooded mafia don who could order death with a whisper. But in 1942, in a cramped Bronx apartment that reeked of mildew and broken dreams, 2-year-old Alfredo James Pacino watched his father walk out the door for the last time. Salvatore Pacino didn't leave a note. He didn't say goodbye. He simply vanished into the East Harlem streets, leaving behind a devastated wife and a boy who would spend the next 83 years trying to understand why he wasn't worth staying for. Rose Pacino collapsed on the kitchen floor that night, her screams echoing through paper-thin walls while little Al pressed his small hands against the cold window, waiting for a father who would never return. That moment, that precise instant when the door clicked shut, would shape every relationship, every performance, every decision Al Pacino would make for the rest of his life. But this is not a story about abandonment. This is a story about survival. Before we continue with this incredible journey, if you appreciate deep biographical content about legendary figures, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. What you're about to discover has never been told this way before. The South Bronx in the 1940s wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a battlefield where poverty waged war against hope every single day. The apartment at 1053 Ogden Avenue where Rose Pacino brought her son after Salvatore left was a single room on the 3rd floor of a tenement building that should have been condemned. In winter, ice formed on the inside of the windows. In summer, the heat was so oppressive that families slept on fire escapes. Rose, Al, and his grandmother Kate shared one bed, their bodies pressed together not out of affection but necessity. The bathroom was shared with 4 other families down a hallway that smelled of urine and despair. Rose Pacino was 23 years old when her husband abandoned her. She took a job cleaning offices in Manhattan, leaving at 5 in the morning and returning after dark, her hands raw from industrial chemicals. But one job wasn't enough. She waitressed during lunch hours, serving eggs to men who looked through her as if she were invisible. On weekends, she took in laundry, scrubbing other people's clothes while her own son wore shirts with holes. Young Al watched his mother's transformation with the attention that would later make him a master of human observation. He saw how her shoulders curved from exhaustion, how she counted pennies at the kitchen table with tears streaming down her face because even after working 3 jobs, there still wasn't enough for both food and rent. But what nobody understood was that her son was already building the foundation of genius in that cramped, cold apartment. Al Pacino's first performances weren't on a stage. They were survival mechanisms crafted in the streets where being small and fatherless made you a target. The older boys could smell weakness, and they circled around the quiet kid with sad eyes and too small clothes. So Al learned to become someone else. He studied the tough kids, the way they walked with exaggerated swagger, the way they held their bodies like weapons. And then he mimicked them so perfectly that even he started to forget where the performance ended and reality began. His grandmother Kate noticed it first, the way little Al could shift his entire being depending on who was watching. With her he was tender and vulnerable. With the street kids, he was hard and unpredictable. With his mother, he performed the role of the good son, hiding his fear and anger behind a mask of obedience. The exit came in the form of a basement theater in the community center on 166th Street. And it would change everything. Al Pacino was 10 years old when he wandered into the basement of the boys' club during a snowstorm. What he found was a makeshift theater where a volunteer drama teacher named Miss Marola was staging a production with neighborhood kids. The space was barely a theater at all, just a concrete room with folding chairs and a raised platform made from wooden pallets. But to Al, walking into that basement was like discovering a secret portal to another dimension. For the first time in his young life, he saw people voluntarily becoming someone else, transforming their entire beings into characters that didn't exist 5 minutes earlier. Miss Marola was a failed actress who'd moved back to the Bronx after an unsuccessful stint in Manhattan theater. When she saw the skinny kid with enormous eyes standing in the doorway watching with frightening intensity, she recognized something. She walked over to Al and asked if he wanted to try. He didn't speak, he just nodded. She handed him a script, pointed to a character, a soldier returning from war, and told him to read the lines. What happened next would become legend in that small basement theater. Al Pacino, who had never acted before, read those lines as if he'd lived them. His voice changed, deepening and cracking with emotion. His body transformed, shoulders pulling back, hands trembling like a man who'd seen horrors. His eyes filled with tears he didn't bother to wipe away. The other kids stopped their rehearsal and turned to watch. When Al finished, there was sacred silence. And then Miss Marola did something she hadn't done in years. She applauded. But genius doesn't pay rent in the Bronx, and Rose Pacino was about to deliver news that would nearly destroy her son's newfound salvation. The performances became Al's obsession, the only thing that made the poverty and his father's absence bearable. He started cutting school to rehearse, spending hours alone on that stage practicing monologues from plays he'd stolen from the library. Miss Marola let him have a key, understanding that for some people art isn't a hobby, it's oxygen. Al would arrive at dawn and perform for empty chairs, perfecting gestures until his throat was raw. He began to live more in those imagined worlds than the real one. The conversation that fractured their relationship came when Al was 13. Rose sat him down at their small kitchen table and told him she'd been offered a better hospital job, but it required night shifts. He was old enough to work now. She'd arranged a job for him at a grocery store. He would need to quit that silly theater nonsense and focus on survival, on being the man of the house. Al felt something break inside his chest. He looked at his mother, at her exhausted face and work-worn hands, and then he just nodded. He said okay. But Al Pacino had just learned the most important lesson of his life. Sometimes survival requires lying to the people you love most. For the next 3 years, Al lived 2 completely separate existences. To his mother, he was the obedient son who worked at Zimmerman's grocery store. But the truth was far more complicated. Al did work at the store, but only when his mother could confirm his schedule. The rest of the time, he was at the community center, rehearsing and performing. He survived on 2 hours of sleep a night, his body running on adrenaline and obsession. He became a master of deception, crafting elaborate lies, forging permission slips, stealing food to keep himself functional. The grocery store became another training ground. Al studied the customers with intensity, memorizing their walks, speech patterns, unconscious gestures. He absorbed them all, filing away their humanity. His boss, Mr. Zimmerman, who enjoyed humiliating his teenage employees, became particularly useful. Al learned how to make himself invisible, how to become so unremarkable that people looked right through him. But the deception couldn't last forever, and the reckoning came in spring 19. Rose discovered the truth by accident, arriving home early from her shift. The apartment was empty. Panicked, she searched for him. She checked the grocery store first, and Mr. Zimmerman told her Al hadn't shown up in weeks, that he'd been fired. Rose felt her legs weaken. She stumbled toward the community center, guided by maternal instinct. She found her son on stage, transformed into someone she didn't recognize, performing a Tennessee Williams monologue about loneliness and yearning. He was magnificent, but Rose didn't see magnificence. She saw betrayal. The fight that followed became neighborhood legend. Rose accused Al of being selfish, of caring more about fantasy than family survival. She told him he was just like his father, a dreamer who abandoned reality. Al screamed back that at least his father had the courage to chase something. The words hit Rose like physical blows. She slapped him hard enough to knock him backward, and then she collapsed on the floor, sobbing with violence. Al stood against the wall, his cheek burning, watching his mother disintegrate. Kate, the grandmother who'd always been silent, finally spoke the words that would change everything. She waited until Rose had cried herself into exhausted silence. Then she said, in Italian, that there are some people born to be sacrifices and some born to be flames, and you cannot ask a flame to become smoke just because fire makes you uncomfortable. She said she'd seen this gift in Al from the beginning. She said Rose was right to be afraid, because this gift would consume Al entirely, would make him a stranger to everyone who loved him. But trying to stop it was like trying to stop a river by standing in its path. You would only drown. Finally, Rose opened her eyes and looked at her son. She didn't smile. She just said very quietly that if he was going to do this, he had better be the best, because she couldn't watch him fail. And Al whispered thank you. The price of that consent would be years of poverty so extreme it almost destroyed them all. Al's acting education began in earnest at HB Studio in Greenwich Village. The classes cost money he didn't have, so he lied, stole, and hustled his way into rooms where he didn't belong. He snuck into classes through back doors. He befriended janitors who let him hide in closets. He volunteered to clean in exchange for watching from the wings. Herbert Berghoff, the master teacher, saw immediately that Al had raw instinct but no control. Berghoff forced Al to unlearn everything, to strip away protective performances, to access genuine emotion underneath. It was psychological torture. Al would be mid-scene and Berghoff would stop him cold. Why are you hiding? What are you afraid to show us? Where is the truth? But technique couldn't pay rent. And by 1961, Al Pacino was literally starving. The jobs were brutal. He worked as a messenger, running packages across Manhattan until his feet developed infected blisters. He worked as a building superintendent, living in a windowless basement. He worked as a furniture mover, destroying his back. And most humiliatingly, he worked as a waiter at restaurants where customers casually discussed their theater projects while Al served them steaks he couldn't afford and wine that cost more than his weekly rent. The restaurant on 47th Street was the worst. The owner ran it like a prison camp. The customers were mostly theater people who'd actually made it. Al had to watch them laugh and celebrate while he scraped their plates, his soul slowly being crushed by proximity to the world he desperately wanted to enter. One night in 1962, something happened that Al would never speak about publicly. A famous director came to the restaurant drunk with friends. He started telling a story about the worst actor he'd seen in auditions that week. He described this terrible actor in cruel detail, mocking his appearance, his voice, his choices. And Al, standing nearby with dirty dishes, realized with horror that the director was describing him. He'd auditioned 2 days earlier, had poured his heart into a death of a salesman monologue, and now he was being mocked by the very person he'd hoped would save him. What Al did next became legend. He stood completely still. Then he carefully set down the tray, walked to the director's chair, leaned close to his ear, and whispered something that made the man's face go white. The director immediately stood up, threw money on the table and left. Al was fired on the spot. But as he walked out into the cold night, jobless and probably about to lose his apartment, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: power. He discovered that even in his most powerless moment, he had the ability to affect someone. And then Lee Strasberg walked into his life and changed everything. The actor's studio was the holiest of holies in American theater, where Brando and Dean had trained under Lee Strasberg. Getting accepted was harder than Harvard. Al auditioned in 1966, age 26. With no formal training beyond HB Studio. The first audition was a disaster. He was so nervous his hands shook visibly. His voice cracked, he forgot lines, and worse, he was performing, putting on a show of emotion rather than accessing real emotion. Strasberg watched with blank expression and simply said thank you. Al walked out knowing he'd failed. The rejection letter arrived 2 weeks later. Al read it once, folded it, and put it in his pocket. He kept it as evidence of failure. And then, instead of giving up, he decided to audition again. The second audition 6 months later was different. He'd spent those months working with new intensity, pushing himself past exhaustion. But more importantly, he'd stopped trying to impress anyone. He'd realized that performances that failed were ones where he tried to show what he could do. What Strasberg wanted was willingness to show who you actually were. So Al chose a monologue about rage and violence and desperation, and instead of performing it, he lived it. He let every ounce of anger and pain pour out, didn't try to control it. He screamed, he wept. He became something feral and absolutely real. The room was silent when he finished. Strasberg, who never showed emotion during auditions, had tears in his eyes. He stood up and walked down the aisle toward the stage. Al stood there shaking, waiting for judgment. And Strasberg said 5 words Al would repeat forever. I almost made a mistake. But acceptance wasn't salvation. It was the beginning of the hardest work Al would ever do. Strasberg's method required actors to access their deepest pain for performances. For Al, this meant confronting his father's abandonment, the poverty, the rage toward his mother, the terror of not mattering. Strasberg would push him to use those experiences in scenes. It was psychological excavation that bordered on therapy, except without protective boundaries. And then in 1968, something showed Al was operating on a different level entirely. The off-Broadway production of The Indian Wants the Bronx was Al's first significant role. He played a violent thug with such authenticity that audiences genuinely feared him. Critics didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't handsome or tall or commanding, but he had absolute authenticity. When Al Pacino was on stage, you couldn't look away. One person who saw the production was Francis Ford Coppola, developing a movie called The Godfather. Coppola was looking for Michael Corleone, and when he saw Al on that stage, he knew he'd found him. But knowing and getting are 2 different things, and the battle to cast Al nearly destroyed both him and Coppola. Paramount executives looked at Coppola like he'd lost his mind. Cast Al Pacino, an unknown theater actor with no film experience, in a central role of their big-budget epic. They wanted Robert Redford, Warren Beatty, Ryan O'Neal, handsome leading men who would sell tickets. They told Coppola that if he insisted on Pacino, they'd find a different director. For Al, the situation was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. He'd been offered the role of a lifetime, but forces beyond his control were conspiring to take it away. He prepared himself for disappointment, for another door closing. But Coppola was as stubborn as Al, and he refused to make The Godfather without the right Michael Corleone. Coppola fought the studio with ferocity that jeopardized his career. He threatened to quit multiple times. He arranged for Al to do a screen test, and when executives finally watched it, something shifted. They agreed to cast Al Pacino, but only if he'd work for almost nothing. Al accepted immediately. He would have done the role for free. The contract paid him $35,000 for a year of work. But Al didn't care about money. He cared about the chance to prove Lee Strasberg hadn't made a mistake. But even after winning the role, Al nearly lost everything in the first 3 weeks of filming. The production was troubled from the start. Executives hated the dailies. Al's performance was quiet, internal, subtle in a way that didn't read well on film. They wanted big, dramatic acting. They told Coppola that Pacino was wrong, that they needed to replace him immediately. If Al didn't deliver something impressive within 3 weeks, he was gone. Al knew he was failing. He'd been given his dream, and he was blowing it. At night alone, he would look in the mirror and see the failure his mother had feared. He thought seriously about quitting before they could fire him. The scene that saved Al was the restaurant murder, where Michael shoots a corrupt cop and drug dealer. It was Al's last chance. Coppola told him to forget the studio, forget the pressure, forget everything except the truth. What would it feel like to kill someone for the first time? Al prepared using everything Strasberg taught him. When cameras rolled, Al Pacino disappeared, and Michael Corleone emerged. The transformation was so complete that the crew watching felt chills. The executives watched those dailies and went silent. They finally understood. They stopped talking about replacing him. And Al, relieved beyond measure, gave one of the greatest film performances in cinema history. When The Godfather opened in March 1972, it changed American cinema and destroyed Al Pacino's anonymity in a single night. The film was a cultural earthquake. Al became an overnight sensation in a way that felt violating. He couldn't walk down a street without being recognized. The attention was suffocating for someone who'd used performance as a way to hide. Al started having panic attacks. Success, he discovered, was its own kind of prison. But Al's biggest battle wasn't with fame. It was with demons that success couldn't exorcise. The years following The Godfather should have been triumphant. Al starred in Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, Godfather Part 2. He became Hollywood's most respected actor. But something was breaking inside. Method acting required accessing deepest pain for every role. He would rip himself open for performance, expose every wound, then immediately move to the next role. It was psychological self-harm disguised as art. The drinking started as a way to come down from intensity. A few drinks became a bottle, then 2 bottles. Al would finish grueling days and drink until he passed out, because unconsciousness was the only escape from voices in his head. The voices that sounded like his father saying he wasn't worth staying for. Cocaine entered during Scarface filming in 1983, and it nearly killed him. The role required playing a character spiraling into drug-fueled paranoia. The line between research and participation became dangerously blurred. Al told himself he was exploring the character, but the truth was simpler. He was self-medicating, using drugs to silence the fear that despite all success, he was still that abandoned child. The morning Al woke in a hospital after collapsing, he made the decision that saved his life. He was 49, hugely successful and completely broken. Doctors told him if he continued, he wouldn't see 55. Al thought about his mother, about sacrifices she'd made. He thought about Kate calling him a flame. He thought about Strasberg saying, "I almost made a mistake." He decided they wouldn't be wrong. He decided to survive. Rehabilitation was months of therapy, learning to separate his emotions from characters' emotions, building boundaries he'd never had. It was facing abandonment without the shield of performance. The hardest lesson was learning he didn't need to suffer to have value, and slowly, painfully, Al Pacino rebuilt himself. The Al who emerged was different. He was more selective about roles. He returned to theater regularly. He reconnected with his mother, and they had conversations about fear and regret and forgiveness. Rose told him she'd been wrong to cut him off. Al said he understood. They sat together and cried for the lost years. Kate died in 1991 at 93. At her funeral, Al spoke in Italian about gratitude. He told the story of her defending him, telling him he was born to be a flame. He admitted every success was as much hers as his. In 1993, Al finally won his first Oscar for Scent of a Woman. He'd been nominated 7 times before. When they called his name, he walked to the stage with visible discomfort. His speech was brief. He thanked Strasberg, his mother, his grandmother. Then he said, "I want to thank the theater, because they never let me down." It was a subtle indictment of the industry that had nearly destroyed him. The question of why Al never married haunted interviewers for decades. He finally explained that his father's abandonment created a wound that never healed, a fear of commitment that was bone deep. He'd loved women, had children with them, but he could never make the promise of marriage, because some part believed he would eventually leave. That abandonment was hereditary. He'd made peace with the fact that he wasn't built for conventional commitment. At 85 years old, Al still returns to theater regularly. Critics sometimes dismiss these productions as beneath someone of his stature, but they don't understand that for Al, theater was never about status, it was about survival, about that Bronx basement where he discovered he could disappear into other lives. It's where the abandoned child and brilliant actor can coexist without contradiction. In 2024, when Al performed King Lear, some critics said he was too old, should retire gracefully. But those who attended saw an 84-year-old man channeling a lifetime of pain into Shakespeare's tragedy about fathers and abandonment. They saw that the flame Kate recognized 7 decades earlier was still burning, dimmer perhaps, but unextinguished. The boy who watched his father walk out a Bronx door in 1942 became the man who walked through doors that were locked against him. His story isn't a fairy tale, it's a survival story. Messy and painful, about the cost of greatness and the price of refusing to be ordinary. Rose worked 3 jobs so her son could eat. Kate told him he was a flame. Strasberg almost made a mistake but corrected it. Coppola fought executives to cast an unknown actor, and Al paid the price in isolation and addiction and wounds that never fully healed. But he survived. And more than survived, he transformed American acting, showing you didn't need to be tall or handsome or comfortable with fame to be great. You just needed to be willing to tell the truth, even when it cost everything. Al Pacino is 85 now. He still acts. He still returns to the stage. He still channels the abandoned child and starving actor into roles that take our breath away. His father walked out in 1942 and never looked back. Al Pacino walked through 1,000 doors that tried to close against him, and he never stopped moving forward. That's the difference between abandonment and survival. That's the difference between giving up and becoming legend.